Okay, so today I'm starting Monopoly. Can anybody tell me which one's the real Monopoly man? This way. Yeah, the one without the monocle's the real one. This is an example of the Mandela effect. You might remember it differently. Anyway, okay, so let's get on. Let's see what we got. Is this on? Okay, I want to give you an example of a Monopoly.
How sweet. You like it, so you put a ring on it. But have you ever wondered why we put diamond rings on things we like at all?
Oh God, you're gonna tell us the awful truth about engagement rings.
Yeah, I am. Hi, I'm Adam Conover. And you may think of the diamond engagement ring as a timeless symbol of love, but it turns out this ancient tradition was invented less than a century ago by the De Beers Diamonds Corporation. Before the 1930s, nobody exchanged diamond rings when they got engaged. It wasn't a thing. Apple, what do you say we get married?
Oh, that's a swell idea, Frank. What do you give me?
Oh, I got the shiny red out.
Sold. Oh, I love you, Frank.
But in 1938, the De Beers Diamond Cartel launched a massive ad campaign, claiming that the only way for a real man to show his love is with an expensive hunk of crystallized carbon. And we bought that shit.
Now, hold on. Looks like if I don't buy you one of these ring dealers, then I'm a tiny pick and pencil man.
Well, it's on the side of a building, so it's gotta be true.
Well, corrupt.
In fact, every element of the traditional American engagement was designed to make more money for De Beers. How much you jump on that rock? Like $4 grand.
Jesus Louise, that's more than your car.
My dad said the rule was 2 months' salary.
Yeah, sorry, dude. That's not a rule. That's just an arbitrary number from an old De Beers ad campaign.
Buy her a diamond worth 1 month's salary. She'll be sure to love you eternally. Profits are down. Better make it 2 months.
This has got to be the most successful ad campaign of all time. This is like if in 50 years people were going, "Oh, honey, the same thing again."
Yeah, you know that old rule. Pizza in the morning, pizza in the evening, that's supper time. When pizza's on a bagel, you must eat pizza all the time.
Well, it's not like I'm throwing my money away. I mean, at least something is worth something.
Actually, diamonds are intrinsically worthless.
I refuse to believe that.
Well, maybe you believe De Beers chairman Nicky Oppenheimer, who once said, quote, "Diamonds are intrinsically worthless."
Shut up, shut up, shut up.
In fact, they're quite common. The only reason diamonds are even expensive is that De Beers has a global monopoly on diamond mining, and they artificially restrict the supply to jack the prices up. But in reality, those assholes have a fuck ton of them.
These are extremely rare.
Pay no attention to that. Which means that diamond you just blew your savings on has virtually no resale value. That's why De Beers wants you to think a diamond is forever. If you never try to sell it, you'll never figure out how badly you got fucked.
Fine, so what do we do about it?
Nothing. They got us by the balls. A century of advertising has embedded the idea of a diamond engagement ring so deeply in our culture that even knowing all that doesn't get you out of buying an engagement ring. Seriously, give it a shot.
Okay. Emily, will you marry me? I'm not giving you a ring because the concept of engagement ring is a scam on the part of the De Beers Corporation. But we could open it. Check the account.
Sorry, dude. Turn off that rock.
Oh, well, thanks, man.
No problem. Join me next time on Adam Ruins Life's Greatest Pleasures when I'll be talking about how puppies only pretend to love you in order to mooch off your food supply.
All right, so today we're talking about Monopoly. Okay, so we're going to talk about what a monopoly is, how a monopoly forms, how a monopoly makes its production decisions to maximize its profit, and calculating that. Okay. So, module 11 was perfect competition. Module 12 now is Monopoly. Module 13 next week, or maybe Wednesday or Friday, is monopolistic competition and oligopoly. Okay, so today is Monopoly. All right. So could somebody give me an example? So other than the De Beers Diamond Corporation, could somebody give me an example of a firm they might think is a monopoly? One seller that sells something that has no similar product. They're very rare. Isn't it interesting? Okay, interesting. Luxottica, what is that? What's Luxottica? What's Luxottica sell? I don't know. Okay. All right. Well, Disney, Apple. So, yeah, so good point. So Disney and Apple, we'd probably consider to be oligopolies because they actually still have a couple of competitors, right? So like Apple competes in the phone market with like one or two other companies, right? They compete in the laptop market with Microsoft, right? Sunglasses. Well, so, I mean, aren't there other brands of sunglasses you can buy? Disney, so Disney's interesting, right? Because, so all the firms named here have what would be considered monopoly power, but they're probably more so going to fall under what we're going to talk about in a few days, which is oligopoly, where firms that are kind of like monopolies, but they still have a couple competitors. So Disney, for example, is not a true monopoly, right? Because there are still competitors. There are other companies that make animated films. There are other companies that you can get streaming services from. You know, Netflix produces streaming services, Hulu. Disney has a monopoly on its own brands. And so we're going to talk about that in a sec. But none of these mentioned here are pure monopolies, okay? They're very similar, though. We can model them similarly. But pure monopolies are rare, okay? So pure monopoly is when there's no competition whatsoever. One firm produces all the output. So obviously Disney is very big and has a lot of control. But Disney has, you know, at least a couple competitors in each of its markets, right? Okay. So again, what does that mean? If there's only one firm, then the market demand curve is the same as the demand curve for the firm's product, all right? And so a monopoly is what we call a price maker. Okay, a monopoly gets to determine the price. So monopoly gets to control the market price of the product because the monopoly is the market. The monopoly controls the market, okay? And so one of the ways that monopolies form is through these things called barriers to entry. We're going to talk more specifically about what those barriers to entry might be, but barriers to entry prevent new firms from entering, okay? So earlier, in fact, let me pull this up real quick. So earlier in the semester, we talked about how, or sorry, not early in the semester, last week, we talked about how if there's profit being made in a market, then firms are going to enter. Okay, firms are going to enter the market, right? Because they see the profit being made. And so firms enter the market, and what happens? Supply increases and prices come back down, right? Competition keeps prices pretty regulated in a competitive market. But we have to think about the fact that, you know, so I thought this tweet was interesting because this is kind of relevant to what we're talking about. POV, you're at a grocery store in the upper Midwest. So apparently they really like Jell-O and pickled ring bologna and these kinds of hats. These kinds of hats are all over the South too, let's be honest. But I thought this was kind of interesting because earlier in the semester, I keep saying early in the semester, last week, well,
It's still earlier in the semester.
yeah, you're right. Technically, it is early in the semester. So actually, earlier in the semester, you learned how if I said the demand for pickled ring bologna increases, we would just shift the demand curve for pickled ring bologna, right? And that's it. We wouldn't shift the supply curve because we learned that, you know, demand and supply in the short run, at least, are independent of each other. We shift that demand curve to the right. You know, it moves up along the supply curve, the quantity supplied increases, but we wouldn't say supply itself changes. But now last week, we start to talk about these long run adjustments. We can imagine that there probably aren't many firms supplying pickled ring bologna in Maine or New Hampshire, but maybe there's a lot in Minnesota, right? I actually don't know. I'm taking this person's word for it, that this is an upper Midwest thing. And so what I want you to think about now is that these long run adjustments are kind of important. So earlier we talked about, you know, there was this on the graphing assignment months ago, there was the question about the immediate effect if fidget spinners go out of style. Well, I said immediate back then because you hadn't learned about the long run yet. So what I meant was, what's the short run effect on the market if fidget spinners go out of style? Well, the demand falls, nothing else, right? If you had answered supply shifts, it would have been wrong. It was the bonus question on the graphing assignment a month and a half ago. But now that we're thinking about these long run adjustments, we can imagine that, hey, if you know, if it's easy to enter and exit the fidget spinner market, we can imagine that a lot of the businesses that were making fidget spinners went out of business, or companies that were making them repurposed their factories from away from making fidget spinners and exited the market, because we have those long run adjustments now. We can think about that, you know, in the short run, maybe people start demanding pickled ring bologna, but in the long run, firms start to enter the market and actually increase the supply of the product. The interesting thing about monopoly, though, is that you can't really have that, okay? So we don't get that adjustment. Monopoly controls the market for as long as it wants, for as long as it can. And so profits get made under monopoly, and nobody can enter the market and start making the product because the monopoly has control. And so an example would be the US Postal Service when it comes to mail, not packages, okay? So packages we'd consider to be oligopoly, which we'll get to in a couple days, right? There's a few big companies that ship packages: UPS, FedEx, DHL. Now Amazon does its own shipping, right? And of course the Postal Service. But if you want to send a letter, you buy a stamp. How can anybody beat that? 50 cents for a stamp, right? I actually don't know what the price of a stamp is, to be honest, but really cheap, right? Local electricity and garbage collection. So not totally, not across the whole United States, but locally. There's one company that provides your power. There's one company that gives you your water, okay? Now, why would that be the case? Why does only one company provide water in Morgantown? Yes.
Now, how does that apply to water? Because people have their own wells and then for their property.
Yeah. Yeah. So if they have a well, they're producing their own water. The same way you wouldn't, if you're growing your own tomatoes in your backyard, you're just not participating in the tomato market, right? But ultimately, your municipal water supply, can anybody tell me why it's so easy for one company to provide that? Like, why don't we have a bunch of companies, you know, like you go in the store, you see 10 different types of bottled water on the shelf. Why don't you have a choice when it comes to the water that comes out of your faucet? Space and cost, yeah, exactly. And so what we're going to talk about now are how costs and also land can act as barriers to entry for firms, okay? So barriers to entry are the legal, technological, or market forces that discourage or prevent potential competitors from entering the market. Now, again, you don't need to write that down word for word, but the bottom line is that barriers to entry prevent new entry into the market. Okay? And so they can lead to monopoly, or they can just limit competition. So it doesn't always lead to monopoly, but it can lead to oligopoly and other forms of markets that are in between perfect competition and pure monopoly. Okay? So that gives us two major types of monopolies. We have a natural monopoly. Barriers to entry are something other than legal prohibition. Okay, so for example, the water company, it had to set up pipes. It had to rip up the roads and set up pipes decades ago. It's very expensive to do that. Okay? The electricity company had to build this massive infrastructure. Okay? Verizon Fios. Now, Verizon Fios is not a monopoly. It competes with Xfinity. It competes with Google in some places. But it still has some monopoly power because competition is relatively limited because it's really hard to build broadband infrastructure. There's actually a lot of debate right now over whether broadband is infrastructure, because that's included in a major bill that the new administration is pushing, is kind of including broadband as infrastructure. Broadband is the stuff that gets you your internet, right? So it's really hard to build that infrastructure. And so that can be, the cost of doing that can give somebody basically a natural monopoly, all right? Then there's legal monopoly. There might be laws prohibiting or limiting competition. We'll get to these more specifically. These are things like patents, copyrights. You know, not only is it a natural monopoly for the local water department to provide water because they've built this infrastructure that's really, really hard to make, but Morgantown probably wouldn't let anyone come in and rip up the roads to install new pipes, right? So the local water company probably has both a natural and a legal monopoly entrenching them in Morgantown, right? Any questions? Yes.
So it was 2016.
Uh-huh.
I don't know how long it's been. they heard about the water crisis that happened. in Charleston. Basically, West Virginia American Water
Mhm.
sits below, it's about a mile from there's a coal cleaning storage facility.
Uh-oh.
I mean, it's coal cleaning chemicals that leaked into the Elk River.
Negative
Got sucked
externality.
right up into that
Yeah.
and went to all the houses.
Geez.
And so then like they got in a bunch of like legal trouble with that. So
Interesting.
what happens if like there was talk about they were going out of business? What would happen if the only water company in the area would get knocked out of business?
Did they go out of business?
No.
Did the government subsidize them to prevent them from going out of business? So probably, right? So if there's a monopoly for something and the monopoly crashes, there's a few things that are going to happen. If depending on the necessity of the monopoly, we would expect the government to probably subsidize it or give it a bailout. This kind of happened, famously with the banks in 2008. The banks were not monopolies, but all the big banks together failed. And so the government bailed them out because they were seen as too big to fail. In that case, with the water supply company, they built that infrastructure. So we would expect them to sell it to somebody else, or the government would take it. Something would have to happen, right? And this is where you get kind of a market failure in that case. And so I would imagine that the local government would probably step in and do anything it could to get things up and running again, because you can't have people without water.
It was a pretty wild ride because
Yeah.
it was 2014, not 2016. We
Gotcha.
also had about a foot of snow at the time,
Jeez.
so we didn't have water and we had a ton of snow.
Yeah.
So it was a good time.
Yeah, so stuff like that happens, and it's just there's so many ways to deal with it. But I would imagine that the government probably gave the company funds to prevent it from going under. So let's talk about natural monopoly. Okay, so now don't be scared by this graph. It's not as bad as it looks. A natural monopoly exhibits what's called economies of scale. It means that the average cost of production is actually going down as the company gets bigger. Let me rephrase that. As the company produces more output. So let's say you spend some fixed cost of $100 million to set up the water infrastructure for a town. You've set up this fixed cost of $100 million. You can even think of it as a sunk cost of $100 million. And let's say you only provide 1 unit of water. Well, then the average cost of that 1 unit of water is like $100 million. But what if you provide 100 million units of water? Now the average fixed cost, right, is only $1. Let's say you provide 1 billion units of water. Now the average fixed cost of each unit is only 10 cents. And so maybe you spend $100 million setting up the water infrastructure, but it only costs a few cents for you to send out a liter of water. And so as you produce more and more water, the average cost is falling because you're taking that original, $100 million investment and dividing it by your output. And so the more output you make, if that 100 million is fixed, the more output you make, the lower your average costs are getting. So that's the idea with a natural monopoly, is they might have some kind of initial outlay that's really, really hard to do, that very few companies can afford. Netflix is not a monopoly, but it's similar. Might cost $100 million to buy maybe $1 billion for all the rights for all the stuff Netflix provides. But what's the cost, the marginal cost of selling a unit of output? Nothing. It costs Netflix nothing to give you a subscription. It costs you $15. So the more subscriptions Netflix gives out, the lower its average cost gets. Because it's just taking that initial outlay of all that money to buy all those rights and just dividing by the number of subscriptions. So Netflix experiences economies of scale, okay? So a natural monopoly can form if you have economies of scale. So there's an example in the textbook about airplane manufacturing. So here's the demand in the market for airplane manufacturing, and it intersects this long run average cost curve at 5,000 units per year, okay? Now, there's this idea of something called constant returns to scale. Constant returns to scale is where average cost is constant as you increase production, okay? But Less than 8,000, if you move to the left of 8,000, you see that that long run average cost curve is moving downward. So as this firm expands its production up to 8,000, each unit is actually cheaper to produce than the last in a way. It's becoming less and less expensive because we can imagine some kind of massive outlay of cash to build the infrastructure to provide the good. But then producing the good in itself, now that the factory's made, is not very expensive. Now, why would only one firm be able to function in this market? So let's say a firm enters and produces less than 5,000 units. Well, if it produces less than 5,000 units, we're looking at this long run average cost curve in this industry. If this firm produces less than 5,000 units, the cost is going to be higher. The average cost will be higher for this firm because the firm that's already there, is getting an average cost of P1 producing 5,000 units. So if you enter the market and produce less than that, you're not taking advantage of economies of scale as much as the other firm. So you can't produce as cheaply. Now, let's say you produce more. Maybe you enter the market and produce between 5,000 and 8,000. Okay. And then you can get, lower average cost than the previous firm. But now you're splitting the market in half. So if you produce more than 5,000, your average cost is lower than the firm that's already there, but demand is only so high. And so what happens is, maybe you're here as one firm and then a new firm enters that produces cheaper than you, but now there's so much quantity in the market that the price would fall pretty drastically. And so the idea with this, and you don't want to produce below your average cost or you're losing money. So we would expect that a monopoly might produce no more than 5,000. Because if it produces more than 5,000, it would have to lower its price. And then we're getting to the portion of the demand curve that's below average cost. And so this firm would start losing money. And so we can see that a new firm entering would not really work here. They wouldn't be able to make any money. And so natural monopoly, taking advantage of economies of scale, pretty much makes it impossible for another firm to compete against you. Okay. All right. So how do natural monopolies form? So economies of scale are large relative to the quantity demanded. And so the idea is that the marginal cost of an additional customer and the fixed costs are already in place. So think about, again, even firms that aren't quite pure monopolies experience this. They have monopoly power. So Netflix spends, maybe $100 million a year maintaining its copyrights, maintaining the rights for the stuff it shows. That's a fixed cost because it doesn't vary based on production. Netflix is not producing, well, Netflix does produce some content, but even thinking about the stuff Netflix doesn't produce, the good Netflix produces is subscriptions. So the marginal cost of giving you a membership is a penny, so low. They spent hundreds of millions in fixed costs setting it up. And so they have not a pure monopoly, but they have natural monopoly power. Okay. The local electricity company, yes.
So wouldn't one expect the cost of a subscription to Netflix to drop after they pulled all the Disney stuff off?
So you're thinking of a reduction in fixed costs.
Mm-hmm.
What we're going to learn soon is that fixed costs don't affect your price. You only care about marginal costs when figuring out price, basically. Okay.
Because I was wondering, since Disney Plus kind of exploded
Mhm.
and they pulled all the Disney stuff from everywhere else.
Yes. The only thing. The only thing we could imagine happening is demand for Netflix's product falling, and that making them reduce their price. But if their fixed costs fall without their demand falling, it's not going to affect their price. So the only things that are going to affect pricing decisions for monopolies are demand and then their marginal cost. Okay. We'll talk about that in a second. And of course, their marginal revenue, which we're going to derive from demand. So ultimately, we have scenarios in natural monopolies where one firm can serve the market more efficiently than many small firms. Okay. So water and electrical companies, it's probably better that we have one company providing electricity in an area or one company providing water in an area, because that one company can provide it more efficiently. Okay. It might not be worth the initial outlay and fixed costs if you can't be the only person providing it. You got to make the money back somehow. And so water companies are incentivized to spend all that money building the pipes because then they can reap monopoly profits. Okay. We're going to talk about that in a sec when it comes to pharmaceutical companies. It's the same idea, right? Local monopolies for goods difficult to transport. That's another thing, right? It's like cement manufacturers. It's really expensive. That those trucks with the back on them that roll the cement constantly, it's a very expensive contraption. Once you've bought that, all you have to pay to transport the cement is the gasoline, right? Okay, hydraulic fuel and fluid and gasoline, right? But ultimately, there's an initial cost of buying that really special truck, right? And then you might have control of scarce resources. So De Beers just owns all the land where all the diamonds are. And so De Beers can charge really expensive prices for this thing that they have an obscene abundance of. Okay. So yeah, so that's control of scarce physical resources. Is another way we could build a natural monopoly. All right. And again, I will post these slides, I promise. So, any questions? Let's see. Any questions? So two main ways that monopolies can form. Natural means they just take advantage of economies of scale. There's this big barrier where, like, to get into this market, you need to spend like $100 million setting up a factory or setting up some kind of infrastructure. But then once it's set up, it's very cheap to provide and you can make a lot of money, right? Okay. And then legal monopoly, which we're going to get to next, okay? All right. So legal monopoly. So sometimes the government enacts barriers to entry for prohibiting and limiting competition. So most legal monopolies are going to be utilities. So again, you know, the local water company has a natural monopoly, but it's also a legal monopoly because the local government is probably not going to let another company, you know, rip up the streets and the sidewalks to install more pipes. Okay. So again, USPS, water, electric, garbage, you know, your garbage company, at least where I'm from, pretty much anywhere I've gone, it's always like Italian last name and Sons. Marzano and Sons, Capaldo and Sons. You know, it's always some Italians and then like their sons running the local trash company. I'm allowed to say that because I'm Italian. But it's funny because if you ever watch The Sopranos, that's one of the main businesses that the mafia runs in The Sopranos is the local garbage collection. So maybe that's why they're all Italians. You know, regulated monopolies to ensure appropriate amount provided to consumers. So again, like your local water and electricity are probably subsidized to some extent. Because again, what does it do? We would generally think that providing water to people, providing electricity creates some kind of positive externality, right? It's good for me if my neighbors have electricity. It's good for me if my neighbors have access to clean water, okay? Because it keeps everybody safe and connected, right? And so these things are probably subsidized at least a little bit in most places, all right? And again, it's subject to economies of scale. So you might give a legal monopoly to a firm that can take advantage of economies of scale, right? And so again, expansion of output, expanding the firm reduces average total cost in the long run. That's what economies of scale is, okay? So Walmart experiences economies of scale. We would assume that the average cost to Walmart of providing its goods is much lower now than it was when Walmart was just one single Walton's store. Okay, Walmart has economies of scale. Amazon has economies of scale. Okay, and again, economies of scale doesn't just apply to pure monopoly. Any questions? All right. So this slide, this is not one where you should write down everything. It's a very informative slide, but the bottom line here is there are several ways where we might protect intellectual property to promote innovation. So one of them is a patent. So what's the problem with pharmaceuticals? It costs hundreds of millions of dollars to research new drugs. once we know how to make the pill, pressing the pill costs a few pennies, okay? And so if Pfizer spends hundreds of millions of dollars producing a drug, and Moderna figures out the formula, all that it takes is one of their employees buying the drug and backwards engineering it in a lab. They can figure out the formula. And then they could start producing the drug, and they could undercut Pfizer's price drastically because they could sell it close to marginal cost. It's like 5 cents per pill. But what's the problem? Pfizer spent $100 million researching it. So we give patents to incentivize big fixed costs like that. There's no, if we get rid of patents, what's the incentive to spend $1 billion researching a drug if someone else can just copy? Right? And so we give limited monopoly power so innovative firms can earn their investment back. Okay. Trademarks, same thing. It's an identifying symbol or name for a particular good. Coca-Cola, TM, right? Copyright. So this is interesting. You can research this on your own. There's actually an Adam Ruins Everything video about this as well. The Disney Corporation frequently abuses this and actually pretty much is almost single-handedly responsible for the way our copyright laws are written, because Disney keeps managing to keep copyrights on things that are like 100 years old at this point, just because it lobbies the government. It's kind of interesting. Trade secrets, right? It might be illegal for you as a chemical engineer working for Pfizer to give away the formula for a drug that you're developing. So you sign a contract with the company, the government enforces it, right? We protect intellectual property so that we can encourage innovation, creation of new drugs and stuff like that, right? Exactly, exactly. All right. This slide isn't really that important. I mean, you know, sometimes we deregulate something and it opens things back up for competition. So the past 10 years or so, you've seen like a ton of different types of beer pop up. That's because the beer industry was recently deregulated. There used to be only like 3 companies that were allowed to produce beer. Now there's tens of thousands, right? Beer was deregulated, and now it's gone from an oligopoly market to a monopolistically competitive market. We're going to talk about the difference, but basically, Yuengling, Anheuser-Busch have lost a lot of monopoly power in the beer market because now you have competitors like, with these bizarre names like Fat Bastard Ale and like Motherfucker Wheat IPA. Like you can get these at like bars and stuff. It's pretty funny. People love to make weird, offensive names for beer. But yeah, so that's the idea. There's like tens of thousands of different types of beer, right? And that's because it was deregulated, okay? All right. And so one way that monopolies might keep power is they might intimidate potential competition. Okay, so for example, predatory pricing. They might threaten price cuts to run other competitors out of business. Or they might even say, if you enter the market, we'll cut our prices really low. What happens? You cut your price, puts the other firm out of business, you raise your prices back up again. Now you may say, well, if a firm enters and then the big bully monopoly firm lowers its prices, kicks you out of business and then raises its price again, why don't you just re-enter? Well, again, we have these big startup costs, right? So the idea is that, there's barriers to entry. So now that you're out of the market, it's really expensive to get back in because now you got to buy a factory again or build a factory again. Okay. So predatory pricing is one way. So these are the summary of barriers to entry. It's in the top hat, so nothing crazy. So you've got these several different kinds. Sometimes the government's involved. Sometimes just market forces on their own create these problems. All right. So which of the following is not a source of monopoly power? Tell me. Folks, by the way, I want to show you that I'm not making this up. Tactical Nuclear Penguin beer, Barbarian Streisand beer, the Great Big Kentucky Sausage Fest beer. right? I mean, hold on. Let's do the AL. Yep, I wasn't joking. I was not joking. Look at that. See, this didn't exist 20 years ago because we deregulated the market. All right. Okay, so innovation actually is a source of monopoly power. Okay, and the reason why. So the answer here, the one that's not, is inelastic demand for the product. And let me. So just to be clear, any market structure can have inelastic demand. Okay, innovation. Okay, think about firms with monopoly power. So not a pure monopoly, but very close to it. Amazon. Amazon has innovated. They've figured out how to make shipping really cheap and effective. Tesla. Okay, not a monopoly, but has some monopoly power because Elon Musk is a very shrewd entrepreneur, right? They've innovated. They've done things that no one else has done, right? So innovation can help build monopoly power for you, okay? All right. So what I want you to understand is that whereas a perfectly competitive firm faces this flat demand curve, no matter what the demand curve in the market looks like, right? The perfectly competitive firm faces this flat demand curve because it's perfectly competitive. It has to take the price from the market. The monopoly is the market. So the monopoly faces a downward sloping demand curve, like a normal demand curve, because it controls the whole market. And so remember, profits, total revenue minus total cost. So now here's the thing. The price charged is still subject to demand, just like it was in perfect competition. But now we have control over the price. We set the price. But we still have to figure out the best price to pick because we can't force people to buy the product. Okay. So monopolies face a downward sloping demand curve. And so again, we're trying to balance our price and quantity to maximize profit. So previously, if we were perfectly competitive, all we had control over was picking the quantity. Now we pick both, but they correspond. If we charge pH, we get QL. And if we charge PL, we get QH. All right, that's bizarre. I don't know why they did that. You get what I'm saying. If we charge this price, we get this quantity. If we charge this price, we get this quantity. Okay. Okay. So what's kind of different is that total revenue is not a straight line anymore for monopoly. Okay. Because now, as you raise your price, your quantity falls. Okay, because you have control over the price. Whereas in perfect competition, you sell as much as you want as long as it's at the market price. Okay. So we have this total cost curve, all this. Don't worry too much. The bottom line is, remember, profit max is not the same as revenue max. Okay. But we don't use these really. What do? We do marginal stuff. So again, here's a chart. This will be on eCampus for you to look at for your reference. But the bottom line is that, remember, you don't really know what your total cost and total revenue are. So you look at things on the margin. Change quantity on the margin. Same rule. MR equals MC. Just like in perfect competition. You set your marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. Where they intersect, that's your profit maximizing quantity. So this firm produces 4 units. But it doesn't charge $600. That's what's going to make this a little different. That's what sets monopoly apart from perfect competition. It charges above this. It charges above marginal cost. So even though marginal revenue at 4 and marginal cost at 4 are both equal to around 600, we're not charging $600. We don't have to, because the marginal revenue curve is actually twice as steep as the demand curve for a monopoly. Marginal revenue for a monopoly is always less than the price. If we increase our quantity, we have to lower our price, which means we're lowering our price for all of our units sold. So our marginal revenue is decreasing at twice the rate that price is. Okay? And so they're separate. Instead of them being the same and this flat horizontal curve, now they're both downward sloping and they diverge. That's a key difference. And so they start at the same place, but marginal revenue decreases twice as fast as price or demand. So now if we combine those, If we combine those, we get this. So this is the last slide we'll do today. Remember, if this were perfect competition, demand and marginal revenue would be the same thing and it would be flat. Now it's a monopoly. Demand slopes down, marginal revenue slopes down twice as steep. They still follow the same rule, MR equals MC. They produce right here, 4 units. But if they're producing 4 units, they don't have to charge $600. They can look at market demand and say, well, if we want to sell 4 units, we can charge $900. And so we're charging 900, then we're looking at 900 and comparing it down to average cost. And so price minus average cost times quantity gives us this dark blue box, which is our profit. Okay. And so we have total revenue, which is the entire shaded area. We have the light shaded area, which is our total cost. And then we have the dark shaded area, which is our profit. And so this monopoly is making profit, and it's going to be able to maintain that in the long run because nobody can enter the market and compete. So a monopoly can stay like this forever and reap these positive profits. All right. Okay. So any questions before we wrap up? Okay. You guys bored? This is the more technical stuff. I know it's kind of, this is like the boring part of econ. I apologize, but you know, we got to get through it. Hopefully I can show you some cool stuff when we get to price discrimination next week, because that you'll know, you'll see. All right. Well, that's all we got for today. I'll see you on Wednesday. Enjoy your Monday night.